thank you so much for having me and for organizing this really fantastic 2 days. I'm delighted to be online with you here in Brussels. And I'm particularly delighted to be speaking after my 2 colleagues from Lille, Laure and Gabrielle. So, and thank you for their great presentation. I think the panel really works well together, and the artwork too, actually, I think really feeds into what we'll be speaking about. So I'm going to get started, and just as I let the cat out of the bag earlier in my question I had in the previous panel, but so I'm really just sort of old school philosopher. I don't have any field work. I don't have any grounded, so I work on artificial intelligence and machine learning, and I'll be mostly talking about intelligence actually, not really about smart. And I think to a large degree, I think that's partly because my research I do mainly in French, and in French, intelligence is used as the translation of smart. And I think to a large degree that can be maintained in English as well. I don't think there's a very important difference between those 2 terms, but maybe that can be debated. So just as sort of a homage to the Canadian setting of this this symposium, I just wanted to quote a few lines from the song Reflector by Arcade Fire, which is a group I really like, and one of their songs is Reflector is about sort of about the contemporary technological experience, and the lead singer of Arcade Fire said that they were inspired by to write that song after reading Soren Kierkegaard's text called The Reflective Age, where Kierkegaard sort of bemoaned at his period already that his contemporaries were plunged into sort of contemplation and looking at things and spectacles of events happening rather than actually doing things and acting. And so just to read the few lines here, because I think it sort of, sure, it's a pop song, but it also sort of expresses something that's very present in the sort of imaginaries and the discourses, be they political, media, or even academic, about sort of this intelligent, smart phenomena. And I think that what it expresses is this sort of mirroring phenomena. We're sort of caught in this prism, as Arcade Fire says, caught in a prism of light, alone in the darkness of white. We fell in love alone on stage at a reflective age, entre la nuit et l'aurore, entre les royaumes des vivants et des morts. All right, so I'm going to move through some of my reflections rather quickly here, and hopefully have time to discuss a few of the points after, and hopefully it'll be comprehensible. So in contemporary discourse, smart and automatic are generally conflated, and the predominant narrative tells us that after the automation of manual labor and the automation of information processing, we are witnessing the automation of learning and prediction, functions generally held to be the expression of intelligent life. Rather than contest this narrative front on, I would like to suggest that there is perhaps a deeper, more uneasy relationship between automaticity and intelligence, one that expresses a sort of behavioral mirroring between humans and machines. At a time when we are seeing increasingly unpredictable and inventive machine learning behaviors, that is, algorithmic behaviors that do not simply correspond to the execution of their programs, we might want to reconsider Harry Collins's claim from the early 1990s in his book, Artificial Experts, quote, there is a large aspect of human behavior that mimics machines, and machines can mimic these aspects perfectly, unquote. I think there's a problem, though, with this, as suggestive as his formulation is. I think there's a problem with this perfectly, that we tend to ascribe to machine behaviors. And the perfectly, of course, embodies this sort of automaticity that we expect from machine behaviors. And it's perhaps time to reflect upon what could be called in Marxist terms a fetish of dead intelligence. That is, an intelligence that's been rendered devoid of its use value and just sort of commodified in its exchange value, whereby things can be considered smart, as if intelligence were a property of things, an objective property of things that could be exchanged, that could be monetized, commodified, and not of social relations. In other words, a perfectly abstract, disembodied form of intelligence. And this move might also help us start unmooring our appraisals and expectations of technology from what Gilbert Simondon, the French philosopher of technology, called a morality of yield or efficiency, whereby the ideal technical operation is supposedly automatic, thus devitalizing it and rendering it, in effect, dead, and making any other kind of sort of aesthetic or social experience of technology impossible, right? I mean, technology's only value putatively, is that it makes things faster, that it optimizes, that it increases yield. Now, if machine learning can be framed as the automation of learning and prediction, it is in part because human cognition has already increasingly been framed as a largely automatic and unconscious behavior. As the philosopher of cognition, Andy Clark, puts it, human cognition is a formidable uncertainty surfing machine. And this is the quote I put up there. It is this kind of automatically deployed, deeply probabilistic, non-conscious guessing that occurs as part of the complex neural processing routines that underpin and unify perception and action. Prediction, in this latter sense, is something brains do to enable embodied, environmentally suited agents to carry out various tasks. So prediction, in this sense, is the process by which cognition extends beyond its bodily envelope into its environment, extends into the body's probable future state within that environment. And in this sense, the algorithmic learning that we're seeing today seems to serve as a sort of model, in the dual sense of the term, of our own behaviors. This, of course, places us directly in the wake of cybernetic theories of learning and behavior, or of Herbert Simon's bounded rationality theory. These approaches had already, in a sense, mourned the ideal of information completeness and of a perfectly transparent correspondence between consciousness and behavior. The idea that action follows a conscious decision, a plan, right? And action is just the execution of a consciously formed idea or plan, which was the sort of basically, conception that had held since the Enlightenment. And I think what we're seeing today is that, throughout the Enlightenment too, we had this idea of the algorithm as a perfectly determinist process that was a step-by-step operation, an execution of a program. And what we're seeing today is, sort of these inventive, unpredictable behaviors of algorithms that are not pure executions of programs. And I think one of the reasons we hear so much critical and policy discourse about the opacity and transparency of machine learning is because we have perhaps not finished this mourning process, and we are still confounded by the prospect that machines that were built to shed light on the secrets of our consciousness have ended up having secrets of their own. I'm going to sort of, I think, skip or just read this very quickly. It's a book by Brian Christian and Tom Griffiths, Algorithms to Live By, where they sort of state this very, clearly that, the intuitive standard for rational decision making is carefully considering all available options and taking the best one, et cetera. That's sort of our, old school approach to sort of rationality and, conscious cognition. And they sort of draw this parallel between contemporary algorithms, and actually that the brain actually works like a limited, bounded algorithm that has to make time-constrained decisions and has, resource-constrained decisions, that the best choice won't necessarily be the optimal choice won't necessarily be the best choice, but it'll be the one that can be made in a certain time, right? And produce a certain effect within a certain time. And that's what actually being rational is all about, they say. So contra, enlightenment, sort of reflective judgment, human behavior and rationality are increasingly being understood as deeply intermingled and lodged in a sort of gray zone between automaticity and consciousness. What we tend to find in its stead of this Enlightenment ideal is an effective technology of behavior, as the behaviorist Boris Skinner had called for in his 1971 Beyond Freedom and Dignity. So while I don't necessarily espouse all these ontological premises or the political consequences drawn from such framing of human behavior and cognition, I do think it helps us bring into new perspective, what Nigel Thrift called a technological unconscious. And so the main idea behind Thrift's idea of technological unconscious is that the efficacy and rationality of our behaviors are in large part conditioned by an array of operating matter of technologies operating in the background, so to speak, telling us everything is working and everything is all right, and everything is working as it should be by their silence, right? And this sort of reminds us of, the sort of French physiologist Claude Leriche, who said that defined health as the silence of the organs, right? So we can sort of think as of this sort of technological unconscious as operating smoothly, correctly, as long as we don't have it in the forefront of our consciousness. When it comes to machine learning, we need to go a step further, though, because this still leaves us with the impression that what is unconscious is perfectly automatic, and that automatic is what we should expect from machines operating in the background of our daily lives. And here I'd just like to turn to a last distinction that the paleoanthropologist André Leroy-Gourhan offered, and I think that's very heuristic. At least it helps me to really think through some of these questions. He offered a distinction between three different levels of behavior, of operative behavior. He distinguishes the automatic, the machinal, and the lucid or conscious behavior. And what's striking about his machinal behavior is that it does not correspond to the machines, the objective machines behavior, but rather that it's the aspect of human behavior that is acquired through learning and repetition within a social group, and that develops into habit and easily falls into unconscious behavior, right? It's brushing your teeth, eating a meal, taking transport, etc. These are all things that we learn, but we don't think about necessarily as long as they run smoothly. But importantly, so they fall into unconscious behavior, but they can always be taken up by consciousness if there's a problem or an obstacle. And this gray zone is what Leroy-Gourhan calls a mental penumbra, pénombre psychique. So in Leroy-Gourhan's distinction, machines actually imitate or externalize the purely automatic behaviors of humans. And we still have this idea that machines are just purely automatic. That's all they do. And that's what should be expected from them. And I think why this seems to work well with things like escalators and automatic doors and conveyor belts and all sorts of other sensors in smart cities, it seems much more difficult to maintain when it comes to algorithmic behaviors that are dynamically interacting and feeding back into our own, which is actually what we're typically talking about. I think when we're talking about smart or intelligent, right? That's what we're expecting, is sort of this dynamic, what Laure and Gabriel actually just talked about. It's sort of just this constant prediction, right? This constant anticipation of users' behaviors. And something we can see also in recommender systems online. So algorithmic mediations have become the technological unconscious or mental penumbra of our daily behaviors, and that regulate the individual's relationship to social groups. The question then is, what happens when things break down, when the automaticity we expect falters and thus rushes into our field of conscious experience? I think if we are to remember the technological unconscious, as Thrift puts it, we must begin by foregrounding the living labor, the social relations and material networks that underpin contemporary smartness. And recent network failures have made headlines and have had spectacular effects. On October 8th, 2021, Facebook services crashed, widespread outage for hours over, from affecting millions of users. On October 14th, OVH's, so a big server provider in France, incurred a massive server failure, which paralyzed thousands of public services and private companies. And while these outages have a spectacular feel to them and are reminiscent of power outages during heat waves, storms, or cyber attacks, they are in fact constantly occurring in the recesses of our technological unconscious. In a wonderful piece of fieldwork on OVH's outages, Carnino and Marquet show the extent to which automaticity works as sort of a governing ideal of data storage and cloud computation infrastructures. This ideal is pursued through data redundancy techniques, which replicate data multiple times across servers in a kind of Freudian compulsion repetition, and through the living labor of an invisible workforce working around the clock to keep such outages out of our collective consciousness, to protect us from the strange mix of dread, relief, and boredom that takes hold of us when we are disconnected from this level of our intelligence. And it is precisely when things fail that labor itself reveals itself. The famous sentence we see pop up, oops, something went wrong, we're working on getting it fixed. Yes, in effect, we're working on getting it fixed. And we see that moment in those moments of failure. We see that dynamic of living labor that's there behind that veil of automaticity. In other words, the smartification of everything need not be thought of as the automation of everything. There is a constant gap between the two, a gap between the ideal of technological efficacy and its effective truth. This is the space where machinal behaviors between humans and machines play out, where our technological unconscious comes in and out of focus with our own mental penumbra. And all we have to do is think about the number of little glitches and bugs that we encounter through these hybrid events, which we've sort of come to hate and love at the same time, I think, because, they've sort of become part of our experience of sociality. And I think, but I don't have time to develop this here, that we could consider this space in terms of a new geography of intelligence, to use Simon Schaefer's term for the distribution of intelligence in industrial modes of production, how we tried to map out sort of how the workshop went to the movement from the workshop to the manufacturer actually changed the way intelligence was distributed within a city. And perhaps speak of an urbanization of intelligence, in the sense that I think another Simon earlier was saying, in the sense of Lefebvre, that not urban as in city, but urban as in a sort of buildup of material, interconnected material throughout space, and a certain production of space that is also transforming our own forms of intelligence. So I'm not so much interested in sort of necessarily what intelligence is doing to a city or to a building, but more about what the process of urbanization is doing to our intelligence. So the hypothesis, and I'm going to end here, I would like to suggest in conclusion, is the following. Machine learning should not be understood as the extension of the automatic. And I think that's really sort of, I think everybody's sort of been touching on that in some way or another, but I think we really need to sort of resist this idea, but from also technology's point of view itself, to say, no, technology is not always, necessarily about automation. But more importantly, as a densification of machinal behaviors, behaviors shared between the living and the dead on the one, shared between the living and the dead, between humans and machines. And the only way we have to judge the smartness of anything is a negative one. What do we do when things fail? Intelligence, by nature, makes mistakes. It is only then that we can begin to offer positive answers, for it is only then that we can experience the concurrent notions of what it means to fail and what it means thus to be intelligent. Thanks for your attention, and I hope I didn't push the envelope too much. Thank you.